She was never meant to be his wife. Evelyn Carter was forced into a marriage with a man in a coma, trapped in a world of secrets, betrayal, and power. But when Alexander Sterling wakes up, with no memory of her, she realizes the real danger has only just begun. Someone wants her gone. And now, the fight for the truth will cost more than just her heart. It might cost her life. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Evelyn Carter never expected her life to change overnight. She had always been the quiet one, the forgotten daughter, the shadow cast by her sister Vanessa's brilliance. Where Vanessa was dazzling, Evelyn was reserved. Where Vanessa was the center of attention, Evelyn blended into the background. She had grown accustomed to it, resigned to the idea that she would never be the one chosen, never the one people looked at twice. But all of that changed the moment Alexander Sterling's accident shattered the illusion of her family's perfect world. Alexander Sterling was a man of power, wealth, and an air of untouchable charm. His name was spoken in hushed tones at business meetings and in gossip columns alike. He wasn't just any billionaire. He was the billionaire. The heir to the Sterling Empire, a man whose influence stretched beyond finance and into politics, media, and every sphere of power imaginable. To the world, he and Vanessa had been the perfect couple, two beautiful, ambitious people destined to build an empire together. Their engagement had been the highlight of the social season, their wedding set to be the grandest event of the year. And then everything unraveled. The accident happened on a rain-slicked highway late at night. His black Aston Martin had lost control, crashing violently into a barricade. By the time paramedics arrived, the wreckage was barely recognizable. Alexander had barely survived. His body, though battered, had healed quickly, but his mind had not. The doctors declared him in a coma, his prognosis uncertain. He could wake up in days, weeks, or never. The news sent shockwaves through both families. But while the world mourned the tragedy of a young, promising billionaire's life hanging by a thread, the Carters were focused on something else: their impending financial ruin. The wedding hadn't just been a union of two people. It had been a business deal, a merger of power and influence. The Sterlings had promised a multi-million-dollar investment into Carter Enterprises, a lifeline that would save Evelyn's father from the mountain of debts he had concealed so well. But now, with Alexander incapacitated, the deal was collapsing. And Vanessa, she wanted no part of it anymore. "I can't do this, Mother," Vanessa had said, her voice cold, detached as she stood in the grand Carter estate. "I won't marry a man in a coma. He might never wake up. My life doesn't end just because his does." Evelyn had been sitting in the corner of the room, unnoticed as always, her book resting in her lap, forgotten. She had watched as her mother, Eleanor Carter, and father, Richard Carter, exchanged tense glances. Their desperation was palpable. "You don't understand what's at stake," Eleanor hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Vanessa's wrist. "The Sterling investment is the only thing keeping this family afloat. If you walk away now, we lose everything." Vanessa had pulled her wrist free effortlessly, her expression bored. Then find another way." And just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn felt her parents' eyes slowly turn to her, calculating, assessing, measuring her like a commodity. Her stomach twisted, a sinking feeling settling deep inside her bones. Her mother was the first to speak. Evelyn. One word, just her name. But in that single moment, she knew. Her father leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his voice low and unwavering. The wedding must go on. Evelyn blinked. "What? You will marry Alexander in Vanessa's place," her mother said simply, as if discussing a business deal, not her daughter's future. Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp sound, completely devoid of humor. "He's in a coma, and he will remain in one whether or not you're his wife," her father said coldly. "But the contract stands, the investment stands. The Sterlings agreed to this marriage, and the marriage will happen, with or without Vanessa." Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out the silence. "No," she whispered. "You can't be serious." Her mother exhaled, slow and controlled, as if she were speaking to a child too naive to understand the weight of reality. "You will do this for the family, for Vanessa's mess?" Evelyn shot back, her voice shaking. "For a deal that she was supposed to uphold? And what about Alexander? What about what he wants?" Her father's gaze hardened. "He is not in a position to want anything." Evelyn stood, shaking her head. "This is insane." Her mother's expression never wavered. "Is it? You would rather let this family drown? Watch everything your father built fall apart? You would rather see us humiliated? See our name dragged through the mud?" Her father's voice was quieter, but no less forceful. "You're our daughter, and that means something. You have a duty." "Evelyn, duty." A word she had heard her entire life. Duty to the family. Duty to their reputation. Duty to everything except herself. Her hands clenched into fists. "And if I refuse?" Her mother didn't blink. "Then we lose everything. And don't expect us to pick up the pieces for you when that happens." It was a warning, a threat, a declaration that if she turned her back on this, she would be alone, truly alone. And so, Evelyn Carter, the woman no one ever chose, was being chosen now. Not for love, not for desire, but for convenience. The wedding happened 3 days later. There was no celebration, no joy, no groom standing at the altar waiting for his bride. Instead, there was only a cold, sterile hospital room, a silent figure lying motionless in a bed, and a justice of the peace standing solemnly beside Evelyn as she murmured 2 words that sealed her fate. "I do." No one else said the words back. There was no kiss, no wedding dance, just a signature on a piece of paper that bound her to a man who didn't even know she existed. When she returned to the Sterling estate as Mrs. Alexander Sterling, the whispers began. "She married a man in a coma? She's just after the money. She'll never belong here." And as Evelyn stepped through the grand iron gates of the Sterling mansion, the place she would now call home, she realized something chilling. She wasn't a wife. She was a prisoner. The Sterling estate was a masterpiece of wealth and power. It stretched across acres of pristine land, with manicured gardens, high marble columns, and walls lined with centuries-old oil paintings. Every inch of the mansion screamed legacy, influence, and unshakable authority. But to Evelyn Carter, it was nothing more than a prison. The first night in her new home was silent, not the peaceful kind, but the eerie, suffocating kind that made her feel like an unwelcome ghost in someone else's life. The staff avoided her gaze, their stiff bows and forced greetings, making it painfully clear that she did not belong here. She wasn't sure what she had expected, maybe a formal reception from the family, a cold but obligatory welcome from Alexander's parents. But there was nothing. No acknowledgement, no words of reassurance. Only the crushing weight of loneliness. Dinner that evening was served in a vast dining hall, where a chandelier larger than her childhood bedroom hung over an impossibly long table. Only 3 people were present. Margaret Sterling, Alexander's mother, sat at the head of the table, a regal woman in her late 50s with ice-green eyes and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Across from Evelyn sat Lucas Sterling, Alexander's younger brother. He was effortlessly charming, with dark hair and an easy smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret barely looked at Evelyn as the first course was placed in front of them. Not a word of congratulations, not even a glance of acknowledgement. Instead, she sipped her wine, perfectly composed, as if Evelyn were a mere inconvenience. "You must feel very lucky," Lucas finally spoke, slicing into his steak with ease. "Married to one of the most powerful men in the country." His voice was smooth, calculated. He wasn't welcoming her, he was studying her. Evelyn lifted her chin. "He's in a coma," she said simply. Lucas smirked. "That doesn't change the fact that you are now Mrs. Sterling." Margaret finally set down her glass. Her expression was unreadable, but her disapproval was clear. "You may carry the name, but do not assume for a second that makes you one of us." Evelyn swallowed, her fingers tightening around the silverware. So, this was how it was going to be. She had known this wouldn't be easy. The Sterlings were ruthless, calculated, and deeply protective of their bloodline. They saw her as a fraud, a gold digger, a nobody. And maybe she was a nobody. But she refused to let them break her. "You misunderstand me," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "I don't want your approval. I only want to make sure Alexander receives the care he needs." Lucas chuckled under his breath. "Is that what this is? You playing the role of the devoted wife?" Margaret's gaze was cold. "Do not embarrass yourself with sentimentality, Evelyn. This marriage is nothing but a contract, and the sooner you remember that, the easier this will be for you." Evelyn met her stare without flinching. "Then let's not pretend to be a family." Margaret's lips twitched slightly, as if amused, but she said nothing more. The meal continued in silence. When Evelyn finally retreated to her new bedroom, far from Alexander's wing, of course, she closed the door behind her and let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had walked into this world with no allies, no support, and no escape. She was bound to a man who couldn't even open his eyes, trapped in a house full of people who wished she didn't exist. And yet she wasn't the only one trapped here. Because somewhere in the mansion, Alexander was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that kept him tethered to life. She had never spoken to him before, never even shaken his hand, and yet here she was, his wife. With nothing else to hold on to, Evelyn made a choice. If this was going to be her life, then she would not spend it cowering. The first time she visited Alexander's room, the head nurse, Mrs. Whitmore, barely looked at her before stepping aside. Evelyn swallowed as she took in the sight of him. Alexander Sterling was a man built for power, even in stillness. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his jaw sharp, his body broad beneath the blankets. He looked like a man frozen in time. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. What did one even say to a man in a coma? After a moment, she stepped forward, resting her hand on the bedrail. "Hello, Alexander," she murmured, feeling ridiculous for talking to someone who couldn't respond. "I know you don't know me, and I don't know you, but we're married now." The words felt absurd. She exhaled softly, glancing around the room. There were books on the shelves. Hardcovers, most of them finance and strategy. A few classics. She traced a finger over the spines before pulling out The Count of Monte Cristo. She hesitated, then sat down beside him, opening the book. "I guess I should get to know you somehow." And so she began to read. The days blurred into routine. Every morning she woke up alone. Every afternoon she visited Alexander's room, reading to him from the books she found in his study. The staff continued to whisper behind her back, the Sterlings ignored her existence, and Vanessa had started showing up at the mansion. Evelyn saw her once in the hallway, dressed immaculately in a white designer suit. She looked just as she always had, confident, untouchable. She smiled at Evelyn as she passed, a slow, knowing smirk. "She won't last here," one of the maids whispered later that day. "Mrs. Sterling has already made it clear. Vanessa was meant to be the bride, not her." Evelyn said nothing. Let them talk. Let them watch her, like an outsider. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here for him. And somehow, in the quiet of the mansion, in the stillness of a life she never chose, Evelyn Carter found herself drawn to the man who couldn't even speak. Evelyn didn't know when it started happening. The small, almost imperceptible shifts in Alexander's stillness. At first, she thought she was imagining it, desperate for something, anything, to break the monotony of waiting. But the more time she spent in his room, the more she began to notice a slight twitch of his fingers, the faintest furrow of his brow when she read a passage aloud, a whisper of breath different from the steady rhythm of the ventilator. The first time she saw it, she froze mid-sentence, staring at his hand where his fingers had just flexed. It was such a small thing, a mere flicker of movement, but to Evelyn, it felt like a shift in the earth beneath her feet. "Alexander?" she murmured, leaning forward. The room was still, the soft beeping of machines the only response. Had it been real? Or had her mind, desperate for progress, created an illusion? She exhaled, shaking her head. "Don't get ahead of yourself." She knew better than to cling to false hope. The doctors had said it could take months, years even. But that night, when she sat by his bedside, watching him in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. The next day she saw it again. She had been reading aloud from The Count of Monte Cristo, her voice soft in the cavernous space of his room. It had become a habit, one of the few things grounding her in this suffocating house. But as she turned a page, her gaze flickered to him, and his lips parted slightly, a shallow breath escaping in response. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She set the book down, inching closer. "Alexander? Can you hear me?" No response, but he had reacted, she was sure of it this time. Heart pounding, she reached for his hand, wrapping her fingers gently around his. "If you can hear me, just move your fingers, just a little." Silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, a single, deliberate twitch. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. A warmth spread through her chest, something dangerously close to hope. She lifted her free hand, pressing the call button for the nurse. She had to tell someone. He was waking up. But just as she did, the door swung open. Margaret Sterling stepped inside, her gaze sharp, assessing. Behind her was Dr. Jonathan Hayes, Alexander's physician. "What's going on?" Margaret's voice was smooth, but Evelyn had spent enough time in this house to recognize the steel beneath it. Evelyn looked at the doctor instead. "He moved," she said, unable to contain the urgency in her voice. "His fingers twitched. His breathing changed when I was reading to him. He's trying to wake up." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, immediately checking the monitors and lifting Alexander's wrist. He pressed 2 fingers to his pulse, then shone a light into his eyes, his face unreadable. Margaret, however, remained motionless, watching Evelyn carefully. After a long silence, the doctor straightened. "His neural activity has been increasing," he admitted. "This could be a sign of improvement." Evelyn turned to Margaret, expecting a flicker of relief. But Margaret Sterling did not look pleased. She looked wary. "You're certain of what you saw?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her fingers clenched tightly around the pearl necklace draped at her throat. Evelyn frowned. "Yeah." Margaret exhaled, then turned to Dr. Hayes. "Keep monitoring him, but do not, under any circumstances, make premature assumptions." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Why wouldn't you want to hope for his recovery?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more careful. Margaret met her gaze. "Because hope is a dangerous thing, Evelyn." And with that, she turned on her heel and left the room. Evelyn sat frozen in place, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. Why wasn't Margaret relieved? Why did it seem like she didn't want Alexander to wake up? That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the high ceiling, her thoughts tangled in a web of unease. Something was off in this house. She could feel it, like a pulse in the walls. And then there were the other things. The whispering staff. The way Lucas watched her like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. The way Vanessa had started lingering in the hallways, a glass of wine always in hand, her eyes alight with a knowing smirk. It wasn't just that they hated Evelyn. It was something bigger. Something darker. Alexander's accident had never sat right with her. It had been too convenient. A mysterious crash in the middle of the night, right before the wedding, before he could finalize the business contracts that tied the Carter and Sterling families together. What if it hadn't been an accident at all? The thought chilled her to the bone. And if she was right, if Alexander had been targeted, then what happened if he remembered? She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere in this house, was hoping he never would. The next morning, Evelyn went straight to Alexander's room. She wasn't prepared for what she saw. His hand, the one she had held just last night, was now strapped to the bed. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned sharply to the nurse adjusting the IV. "Why is he restrained?" The woman barely looked at her. "Doctor's orders, just precautionary measures." "Precaution against what?" Evelyn demanded, stepping forward. The nurse finally met her gaze, expression unreadable. "They don't want him moving too soon. It could be dangerous." Evelyn clenched her fists. That was a lie. A blatant, obvious lie. Someone in this house didn't want Alexander Sterling waking up, and Evelyn was going to find out why. That night, she made a decision. She was done being passive. She would fight. For the truth. For Alexander. For herself. Even if it meant burning this house of secrets to the ground. Evelyn was already awake when the news came. She had spent the night tossing in bed, her mind restless with unanswered questions. The growing certainty that Alexander's accident had been something more than just misfortune had settled deep in her bones, keeping her alert long after the mansion had gone quiet. She had lain in the darkness, listening to the eerie stillness of the house, feeling like she was being watched. A presence that never quite revealed itself, but was always there. So, when a frantic knock sounded at her bedroom door at dawn, she was already sitting up. "Mrs. Sterling!" It was Dr. Hayes's voice, urgent, strained. Evelyn's heart dropped. She rushed to the door, throwing it open. The doctor stood there, his expression tight with something she couldn't quite place. Anticipation? Worry? Fear? "Alexander," he said. "He's awake." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. She had imagined this moment so many times, had prayed for it, dreaded it, longed for it. And yet, now that it was here, she could feel nothing but a wild, erratic pulse pounding in her chest. She forced herself to move, pushing past the doctor and down the long hallway toward Alexander's room. Her bare feet slapped against the cold marble floor, her nightgown whispering around her ankles. This was it. The moment everything changed. The door to his room was open when she arrived. Inside, the world stood still. Alexander Sterling was sitting up. His dark hair was tousled, his face leaner than before, the sharp angles of his jaw more defined from weeks of stillness. His usually commanding presence was dulled, weakened, but his eyes, those piercing, ice-gray eyes, were open. Awake. Alive. Evelyn's breath hitched. He was looking at her. And then he spoke. "Who are you?" The words hit her like a slap. Evelyn froze, staring at him as her stomach turned to stone. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was no recognition in it. No warmth, no familiarity. He didn't know her. Dr. Hayes stepped in, clearing his throat. "Alexander, this is your wife, Evelyn." Alexander blinked, frowning. His gaze flickered over her, assessing, distant. "My wife?" Evelyn's throat was dry. She nodded, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Yeah." Alexander's frown deepened. "That doesn't make sense." He looked toward Dr. Hayes. "I was engaged to Vanessa Carter." The name slashed through the air like a blade. Evelyn felt the room tilt. He remembered Vanessa. Not her. Dr. Hayes gave her a careful glance before turning back to Alexander. "You were, yes, but there was an accident." Alexander's expression flickered with frustration. "I remember the accident. I was driving. It was raining. And then—" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to push through the fog in his mind. "Everything after that is blank." Evelyn could feel Margaret Sterling's presence before she even turned around. The sharp click of heels against the floor was the only warning before Alexander's mother stepped inside. Her expression was one of measured relief, but her eyes, cold, calculating, unsurprised. "Alexander," she said smoothly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You're awake. Thank God." Alexander looked at her, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Mother," he murmured. She smiled, stepping closer. "You've been unconscious for 6 weeks. We've all been so worried." He exhaled, nodding. I don't understand. What happened?" Margaret's gaze flickered to Evelyn before she turned back to her son. "You had an accident, darling, and while you were recovering, things changed." Alexander's jaw tightened. Clearly. His gaze moved back to Evelyn, still puzzled, still utterly detached from her. Why did I marry her? Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. It was necessary, she said softly, to protect our family's future. Evelyn's stomach churned. So that was how they were spinning this. Not that she had been forced, not that Vanessa had abandoned him. Just a cold, calculated business decision. Alexander turned back to Evelyn, studying her again. There was something unsettling in his gaze. Not anger, not distrust, but emptiness. As if he was looking straight through her. "You don't remember anything about me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. He shook his head. Not a thing. Evelyn swallowed hard. She had braced herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for how much it would hurt. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat. It's normal for coma patients to experience memory loss, especially surrounding traumatic events. It may take time for everything to come back. Margaret's expression didn't change. Or perhaps it's best if some things stay forgotten. Evelyn's gaze snapped to her. She was hiding something. And suddenly, Evelyn realized the real danger wasn't Alexander's amnesia. It was the fact that the people surrounding him, the people who had everything to lose if he remembered, were in no rush to help him regain his past. And if she wasn't careful, they would erase her from his life entirely. The following days were hell. The house felt different now, buzzing with renewed energy. Staff moved more quickly, conversations had a new edge of excitement. The air had returned. But Evelyn? She was invisible. Alexander spoke to her only when necessary. He was polite, distant, detached. She could tell he didn't trust her. And why would he? To him, she was a stranger who had been forced into his life. Meanwhile, Vanessa had returned. Evelyn spotted her one morning, sweeping through the grand foyer in a deep red dress that clung to her frame. Perfectly poised, perfectly dangerous. She smiled at Evelyn as she passed, a slow, knowing smile. "I guess you weren't as unforgettable as you thought," Vanessa murmured before disappearing down the hall. Evelyn wanted to scream. She wanted to grab Alexander and shake him, tell him everything, make him remember, make him see. But it wouldn't matter. Not yet. Because someone in this house wanted Alexander's memories buried. And if Evelyn wasn't careful, they would bury her along with them. Evelyn had always known that Vanessa would return. She had felt it in the shifting energy of the mansion, in the way Margaret's lips curled in subtle satisfaction, in the whispered conversations between the staff. The moment Alexander opened his eyes and remembered Vanessa but not her, it was as if the entire house had exhaled, as if the intruder was finally losing her grip on the throne she had never wanted in the first place. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, Vanessa walked through the doors of the Sterling estate like she had never left. She arrived in a striking red dress that screamed power, her golden hair in flawless waves, her lips curved in that practiced smile that Evelyn had spent a lifetime understanding and resenting. She had always been like this, effortlessly magnetic, dangerously beautiful, and utterly self-serving. Evelyn had been standing at the top of the grand staircase when Vanessa entered, flanked by Lucas on one side and Margaret on the other. They looked like royalty welcoming back their exiled queen. "Oh, Evelyn," Vanessa called up to her, her voice dripping in amusement. "Still playing house, I see?" Evelyn clenched the banister so hard her knuckles turned white. She had prepared herself for Vanessa's return. but she hadn't been prepared for how much it would hurt. Not because she was afraid of losing Alexander, he had never been hers to begin with, but because this was how it had always been. Vanessa took, and Evelyn was expected to step aside. She wouldn't. Not this time. Evelyn descended the staircase slowly, meeting Vanessa's gaze head-on. "Welcome back," she said coolly. "For a moment, I thought you had moved on to better things." Vanessa's lips curved. "Oh, but Alexander is the best. You wouldn't know that, of course." She tilted her head, feigning pity. "Not really." Margaret sighed, as if bored by their exchange. "We have more important things to discuss than childish insults." She turned to Vanessa. "He's awake, but his memory is fragile. I expect you to be careful." Evelyn felt that warning as much as Vanessa did. Careful about what? Careful not to say too much? Careful not to let Alexander remember something he wasn't supposed to? Vanessa's smile didn't falter. "Of course, Mother Sterling." Evelyn wanted to tear that smile off her face. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked away. She wouldn't give Vanessa the satisfaction of a fight, not yet. But war had already begun. Alexander was different now. It wasn't just the memory loss, it was something else. A shadow of doubt lingered in his gaze every time he looked at her, as if she were an enigma he couldn't quite place. He didn't push her away, not exactly. But he also didn't seek her out. Meanwhile, he let Vanessa in. Evelyn had seen them together in the garden. Vanessa laughed like a song rehearsed to perfection, her hand on his arm as she reminded him of their past. And Alexander, he listened. One night, Evelyn was walking down the hall when she overheard them talking. "I feel like I should remember more," Alexander admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Everything is in pieces, but you, I remember you." Evelyn's breath caught. Vanessa's voice was soft, persuasive. "That's because we belonged together, Alex. You loved me. We were meant to be married." There was silence. A heavy, dreadful silence. Then Alexander spoke, hesitant. "Then why didn't you stay?" Evelyn's heart pounded. Vanessa hesitated for only a second before sighing. "I was scared," she whispered. "The accident, it broke me. I should have been there. I regret leaving every day." A perfect lie. And Evelyn knew that Alexander, with no memories of the truth, would believe it. She had heard enough. Evelyn turned and walked away before she could hear more, before she could hear him say something that might shatter her completely. She didn't know why it bothered her so much. She had never wanted to be here. She had never wanted this life, this marriage, this fight. And yet, somewhere in the past few weeks, somewhere in the nights spent by Alexander's side, in the moments when his fingers had first twitched in hers, in the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he might wake up and look at her with recognition, somewhere along the way, Evelyn had started to want, and that was dangerous, because wanting meant she could lose, and losing meant she would be left with nothing. That night, Evelyn stood outside on the mansion's balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She felt small beneath the vast sky, beneath the weight of everything she could not control. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting a servant, but it was Alexander. For a second, neither of them spoke. The moonlight cast shadows across his face, making him look both hauntingly familiar and heartbreakingly foreign. "You're avoiding me," he said. Evelyn arched a brow. "Shouldn't I be the one saying that?" Alexander studied her. "I don't know you," he admitted, his voice almost apologetic. "And yet, I feel like I should." Evelyn swallowed. There it was again, that pull between them. "You don't remember our wedding?" she asked quietly. "No, you don't remember me reading to you? Sitting by your bed while everyone else treated you like you were already gone?" He stilled. For the first time, a flicker of something real, passed through his expression. "I don't know why you stayed," he murmured. Evelyn's throat tightened. "Because I promised I would." The words hung between them. And then the sound of laughter. Vanessa's laughter from inside the house. The moment shattered. Alexander's gaze flickered toward the sound. His expression darkened, uncertain. Pulled between two worlds. And Evelyn knew. She was losing him. Because Vanessa wasn't just rewriting the past. She was erasing Evelyn from it. And if Evelyn didn't act soon, she would disappear entirely. Evelyn had spent most of her life being overlooked, but she had never truly known what it was like to be erased. Until now. It was happening faster than she could stop it. Each day, Vanessa tightened her grip on Alexander, feeding him carefully constructed pieces of the past, filling the void of his memories with a story that suited her best. It wasn't just about their supposed love story anymore. It was about rewriting history. Vanessa was turning herself into the woman who had never left, the one who had always been there for him. And Evelyn? She was being painted out of the picture entirely. At first, Evelyn tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that Alexander would come to his senses, that his instincts would tell him something wasn't right, that he would remember. But then, one morning at breakfast, she realized just how far gone he already was. "I don't see why we're keeping up this farce," Vanessa said lightly, stirring sugar into her tea. "The doctors said he needs stability, didn't they?" She glanced at Margaret, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Evelyn had learned to read those nods. They meant plans had already been made. Alexander looked up from his plate, expression unreadable. "What farce?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "You and Evelyn, this marriage, you don't even remember it." Evelyn's fork clattered against her plate. The entire room seemed to go silent. Even Lucas, who had spent most of breakfast smirking at his phone, paused, his gaze flickering between them. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Margaret didn't look at her. That was what made Evelyn sure. This conversation had been planned. Alexander was quiet for a long time. Finally, he exhaled. "I don't remember it," he admitted, glancing at Evelyn. "And I don't understand it." Evelyn felt her breath catch. Margaret took a sip of coffee. "Then, perhaps, it's time we correct that mistake." It was like the floor was tilting beneath her. "Annulment," Vanessa said, the word rolling off her tongue like silk. "It's the logical choice." Evelyn's heartbeat thundered. Annulment. As if she had never been his wife at all. She turned to Alexander, waiting for him to protest, to hesitate, to show even a flicker of uncertainty. But he didn't. He was still looking at her, but there was no anger in his gaze, no guilt, just cold, measured calculation. Like he was considering it. For a split second, Evelyn thought she might actually break. But instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and forced herself to smile. If, That's what Alexander wants, she said, her voice smooth, unwavering. Then he should say it himself. The room went silent. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Evelyn turned fully to Alexander now, meeting his gaze without flinching, daring him. Say it. Tell me you want me gone. Tell me you believe everything they've told you. He'd look away, and for the briefest moment something flickered in his eyes. A hesitation. A question. It was enough. Evelyn rose from her chair, ignoring the tremor in her hands. You can let me know when you've made your decision, she said, and then she walked away before she could fall apart. Evelyn had never been one to cry, but that night she sat in the dim light of her bedroom, her hands clenched into fists, fighting back every emotion threatening to consume her. They wanted her gone. They wanted to erase her completely, and she had almost let them. She had spent weeks waiting, hoping Alexander would remember, but hope wasn't enough. Hope was what got people killed in this house. She needed the truth, and she needed it fast. With renewed resolve, she wiped her face, stood, and headed straight for Alexander's study. If he wasn't going to remember on his own, she would find the proof herself. The study was dark, silent. She hadn't been inside since Alexander's accident, but nothing had changed. The mahogany desk was still lined with neatly stacked papers, the bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that probably hadn't been touched in years. She moved quickly, scanning the shelves, the drawers, the files. There had to be something. And then she found it. Buried beneath a stack of business contracts was a single, yellowed letter. She unfolded it carefully, her pulse racing. It was addressed to Alexander, and it was from his father. Alexander, there are people within this family who will do anything to keep their grip on power. Trust no one, not even the ones closest to you. If anything happens to me, remember this. The accident that took your mother's life was no accident at all. Look closer. Dig deeper. And whatever you do, don't let them control you. Evelyn's hands shook. The accident. The same accident Margaret never talked about. The same one that had left Lucas the heir before Alexander took over. And if someone in this house had been responsible for that, had they been responsible for Alexander's accident too? Evelyn. The voice startled her so badly she almost dropped the letter. She turned sharply and found Alexander standing in the doorway. His eyes were darker than before, unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Evelyn hesitated. Then, without a word, she held up the letter. Alexander's gaze flickered to it, his jaw tensing. She watched as he stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. He took the letter from her hands, his eyes scanning the words. She saw the exact moment it hit him. His grip on the paper tightened. He looked up at her, and for the first time since he had woken up, there was something real in his expression. Something dangerous. "You were never supposed to find this," he said quietly. Evelyn's pulse pounded. "Then why was it hidden in your own office?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then, "Come with me." Evelyn blinked. "What?" Alexander grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "I need to show you something." Evelyn didn't argue, because for the first time since he had woken up, he wasn't looking at her like a stranger. He was looking at her like someone who needed her. And that changed everything. Evelyn followed Alexander down the dimly lit corridor, her heart pounding with every step. He hadn't spoken since they left the study, his grip firm around her wrist, his pace quick and unrelenting. There was something different about him now, something sharper, darker, more determined. He wasn't the lost man searching for answers anymore. He had found something. He led her through the house with purpose, past the grand hall, past the rooms filled with glittering chandeliers and antique furniture meant to impress, past the silent staff who barely glanced their way. Then, finally, he stopped. They stood before a door Evelyn had never seen before, hidden behind an old bookshelf in one of the lesser-used wings of the mansion. Alexander reached forward and pressed his palm against the wooden panel beside it. There was a soft click, and then the bookshelf moved. A secret passage. Evelyn's breath hitched. Of course a house like this would have hidden places. Without a word, Alexander stepped inside, pulling her with him. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark, lined with dust-covered files and forgotten records. The air smelled of old paper and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. Alexander finally released her wrist, stepping toward a small desk at the end of the hall. It was covered in old documents, some yellowed with age, others appearing newer. "This," he said, his voice low and controlled, "is where my father kept his real records, not the ones in his official office. These were the things he didn't want anyone else to see." Evelyn swallowed. "And you think the answer is here?" Alexander didn't answer right away. He picked up a file, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the contents. Then, with a deep inhale, he turned the page and passed it to her. Evelyn took it, her gaze falling to the words written in careful, almost nervous handwriting. It was a medical report. Subject: Margaret Sterling. Her stomach twisted. "Alexander?" she whispered, looking up. "Read it," he said, his tone deadly serious. Evelyn forced herself to continue. "Psychological evaluation indicates increased paranoia and controlling behavior. Recommends careful monitoring. Patient history includes past suspicions of orchestrating car accident. Unconfirmed." Her entire body went cold. She looked at Alexander, wide-eyed. "Your father... he thought Margaret had something to do with..." "My mother's death," Alexander finished, his jaw clenched. "Yes." Evelyn felt lightheaded. This was proof. Proof that his father had suspected foul play in the crash that had killed Alexander's mother years ago. But it wasn't just that. There were more files. One for Lucas, one for Vanessa, and one for Alexander himself. She flipped to his file, her pulse racing. It was another medical document, from the night of his accident. Her eyes scanned the words, and then she froze. Blood work results. High traces of sedatives found in bloodstream. Possible interference with cognitive function. Lab report suggests external administration before accident. Evelyn nearly dropped the page. Sedatives. Not alcohol. Not drowsiness. Someone had drugged Alexander before his accident. She looked up, and for the first time she saw real rage in his expression. "They didn't just want me gone," he murmured. "They wanted me incapacitated." Evelyn felt sick. Who do you think did it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Alexander exhaled sharply, turning to another page. The final file. This one wasn't about him. It was about Lucas. Alexander flipped the folder open, his eyes narrowing. Then he passed it to Evelyn. Inside was a confidential business contract, dated 1 week after Alexander's accident. Lucas Sterling had quietly transferred company shares to his name. It was legal, but only because Alexander had been declared unfit to run the company. He took control the second I was out of the picture, Alexander said, his voice like steel. He knew I wouldn't be able to fight back if I never woke up. Evelyn's chest tightened. This wasn't just a case of stolen power. This was an orchestrated attack. Someone had drugged Alexander. Someone had ensured his accident happened at the right time, and when he fell into a coma, Lucas had been the one to benefit. And now that Alexander was awake, he was a threat again, a dangerous, unpredictable variable in their plans. Evelyn clenched her fists. "We have to do something." Alexander looked at her, something dangerous and calculating in his gaze. "Oh, we will," he said. Then, suddenly, a noise, a creak from above them. Evelyn froze. Alexander's eyes snapped up to the ceiling. They weren't alone. Someone had been listening. Before Evelyn could react, the lights flickered out. Darkness. Then, a crash. And Evelyn knew. They had been found. And whoever was watching, they weren't going to let them walk out of here alive. The moment the lights went out, Evelyn knew they were in danger. Her pulse thundered as the darkness swallowed them, her senses sharpening in the silence that followed. Then, a sudden, violent crash from above. Someone was here. Someone who did not want them to leave this room alive. Alexander reacted first. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her sharply behind a heavy wooden desk, just as footsteps thundered from the hallway beyond. The secret passage had been compromised. Elin sucked in a sharp breath, her mind racing. Had they been followed from the beginning? Had Margaret or Lucas known about this room all along? Then, a metallic click, a gun being cocked. Her stomach dropped. Alexander's grip on her tightened, his breathing controlled, measured. He was thinking, calculating. Even after being betrayed by his own family, nearly killed, and having his memory wiped clean, his instincts were still razor-sharp. The footsteps were getting closer. Too close. They had seconds before whoever was outside made their move. Evelyn turned to Alexander, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to run." He nodded once. Then, all hell broke loose. The door to the hidden room burst open, splintering as a figure charged through. Evelyn barely had time to process the shadowy silhouette before Alexander moved. Faster than she had ever seen him, he grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it. It struck the intruder in the side of the head with a sickening thud. The man stumbled, swearing, his gun clattering to the floor. Alexander didn't hesitate. He grabbed Evelyn's hand and pulled her into motion. They ran, out of the hidden room, down the darkened hall, past the grand empty ballroom where Evelyn had once stood alone on her wedding night, drowning in regret. Now she ran for her life beside the man she had once thought she would lose. Another gunshot rang out, shattering the silence, missing them by inches. Evelyn's breath hitched. "They're trying to kill you," she gasped as they reached the grand staircase. Alexander didn't even look surprised. "I know," he muttered. Then, a voice from above. "Well, this is unexpected." Evelyn froze. At the top of the stairs, Lucas stood. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were in his pockets, his posture too casual for someone who had just ordered their execution. Behind him, Vanessa emerged from the shadows. She looked amused. Did you really think you could sneak around without anyone noticing? She asked, tilting her head. Oh, Evelyn, you're smart, but you've never been clever. Evelyn felt cold. Vanessa had known. She had always known. Alexander took a slow step forward. His face was calm, but his entire body was rigid, with barely contained fury. You tried to kill me, he said, his voice low, dangerous. Lucas exhaled dramatically. Kill? That's such a strong word. I prefer remove. Alexander's jaw clenched. Lucas smirked. You were never supposed to wake up, you know. It would have been much easier if you just stayed down. Evelyn saw the moment Alexander snapped. Before Lucas could react, Alexander lunged. Lucas barely had time to move before Alexander grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wall. For a moment, Lucas actually looked afraid. You think you can just take everything from me? Alexander hissed, his voice raw with rage. You think I wouldn't fight back? Lucas struggled against his grip, but Alexander was stronger. Vanessa took a slow step forward, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Alexander, stop. You're acting crazy. Alexander did not stop. He pressed Lucas harder against the wall, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You drugged me, he growled. Did you do it yourself, or did you have someone else poison me? Lucas's smirk faltered. Tell me, brother. Lucas said nothing. Evelyn moved then. She had seen enough power struggles in this family to know when something was about to spiral out of control. She reached for Alexander, placing a hand on his arm. Alex, she murmured, he's not worth it. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. His grip on Lucas remained firm, his entire body rigid with tension. But then, he exhaled. Slowly, he let go. Lucas stumbled, coughing, but the fear in his eyes remained. Alexander turned to Evelyn, his gaze sharper, clearer. He wasn't confused anymore. He knew, and he wasn't going to let them win. We're leaving, he said. Lucas laughed, breathlessly, rubbing his throat. You think you can just walk away? Alexander smiled. It was the first real smile Evelyn had seen from him since he had woken up. I don't think, he said. I know. Then he took Evelyn's hand and they walked out together. Past Vanessa. Past Margaret. Past the house that had tried to break them both. As they stepped outside into the cold night air, Evelyn finally felt free. She turned to Alexander, her pulse still unsteady. He was already looking at her. You stayed, he murmured, as if only now realizing what that meant. Evelyn swallowed. I promised. I would. A long silence stretched between them. Then he reached for her. His hand, warm and steady, curled around hers. And this time she let him. Because for the first time since this all began, they were finally choosing each other. Not for power, not for survival, but for them. And that was real. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. Evelyn and Alexander's journey was filled with betrayal, survival, and a battle for the truth. But more than anything, it was a story about resilience. Life often places us in impossible situations, forcing us to choose between what is easy and what is right. Evelyn chose to fight, not just for herself, but for something greater. Her own worth, her own future, and the truth that others tried to bury. This story reminds us that our past does not define us, but our choices do. No matter how much others try to erase us, as long as we stand our ground, we can rewrite our own destiny. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to fight for yourself, even when the odds were against you? Let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more gripping tales coming your way. Stories that inspire, challenge, and keep you on the edge of your seat. See you in the next one.